Hi friends, I'm Suzanne Mancuso and I am the author of The Secret World of Magic Dolls and Imaginary Friends, The Dolls of Cold Spring Village. And let's begin. Chapter 1. The year was 1935 and I had just turned 11 years old. The Great Depression was among us, but you would never know it by looking at our happy little town from the outside. Tonight, I find myself standing in front of our favorite toy shop. I was with my sister on a chilly evening in December. My reflection beamed as I gazed upon myself through the clear glass window. My fingertip held my braid's end, and my eyes looked deep inside this magical toy shop at the many dolls and teddy bears on display there. My sister and I loved to peek in the enormous display at Hudson's Toy Village, so my mother would walk us there briefly after church every Wednesday evening. Sally Ann was turning 5 and she was still a rascal. My mother had to watch her closely because she had to find trouble every day. Tonight, the two of us stood in front of this toy shop for some time. But for some unknown reason, Sally Ann oddly licked a mouthful of unclean snow off the ledge and spit it onto her white church shoes. My mother leaned forward, pulling her away from the snow-covered ledge, so I could enjoy the window display for just a few more moments. This grand store was located in Putnam County, just a few blocks from where we lived. My family and I were located in a small town about 50 miles from the big city of New York. We live in a country village called Cold Spring, right near the train station. Teacher says that George Washington actually drank from this spring, and it was quite cold, so the term Cold Spring was used ever since. My father worked here at our train station, and he was a tall man that usually wore a blue shirt with a white shirt underneath. His red and blue cap read conductor on it, and he collected tickets from the passerbys all day long. On the warm weekends, my father and I would go to the train depot and sit right on the dock to see how long the trains would take to pass by. The train was followed by miles of billowy gray steam that dissipated into the trees above. The sailboats and enormous cargo ships would float by on the galloping river, one right after the other. The ships would dock near the waterfront, which was located near the main courtyard. You could also see the majestic trolley as it rolled up and down the hills. Our little town of Cold Spring is a symbolic town with many travelers that travel all year round. It was always filled with its herbal countrysides and its abundant bouquets for all that visit this charming place. In the winter, this colorful village would turn an exquisite ivory shade, and then many ice skaters and skiers would run over the town's inns to find their wintry playground. Nearly every day, the sapphire sky in Cold Spring was filled with hundreds of seagulls, flocking birds and cranes. Their noise was so loud and deafening, if you threw them a handful of food, you would have to run for cover. The river water here was a sparkling shade of hazel green. It was the best place in town to skip rocks and feed the birds. At the end of every week, my father and I would take turns skipping stones across the large body of river water, and as hard as we tried, we actually never could really reach the other side, yet. On the left side of the street, at the bottom of the hill, was Ramsey's Fish Market. On the door next to that belonged to Miss Molly, the owner of the most fancy hat shop in town. On the other side of the street, you could see Cold Spring Harbor Bridge in the distance. And while you were standing in the decadent chocolate shop, you could always hear the owner of the bistro yelling in Italian. And although we never understood what she was saying, from the tone of her voice, she was always very angry with him. Above the general store, there lived old Mrs. Daly. She was a round lady that never seemed to change. Mrs. Daly lived there with her plump little dog, and they were quite the sight to behold. They were both short and rather on the chubby side. They had very hard time going up and down the stairs to get to their shabby little doorway. When we would walk past, Mrs. Daly would always say a polite, "How do you do?" But she would be on the first step, and when you would pass by an hour later, she would only be halfway up the staircase. The two of them never seemed to move any further. They merely lingered around the middle of the stairway. Underneath Mrs. Daly lived Mr. Ferguson. He lived in the lower apartment next to the general store in town. He sat there all day, every day, and everyone that passed him during the day would be forced to engage in a long-winded conversation. There, they would have to stand for a long time, waiting for some other unsuspecting person to walk by and relieve them. My friends and I would try to sneak by the back of his house, but he usually got up and wandered back to see who was in the back of the house too. On a hot day last year, Jason and James Rogers threw an old shoe at Mrs. Daly's hanging bloomers. Her large spotted bloomers gallantly swayed in the summer breeze. Mr. Ferguson saw this happen and laughed really hard with the rest of the kids. Just when James decided to throw a second shoe at the dotted underwear, both of the bloomers and the shoe went flying off the line directly into the neighbor's open window pane. Mr. Ferguson laughed so hard he fell off his milk crate onto the ground behind him, so all you could see was Mr. Ferguson and the soles of his worn-out shoes. They kicked and bucked wildly as he flailed around the dirt and the grass, and two neighbors had to help him back to his seat, so all of the children then ran away. Very soon it would be Christmas time again. I had so longed for that certain precious doll that we saw standing in Hudson's store, and it was there for ages. The store was filled to the rafters with armies of dolls that stood about 2 feet tall. There were rockabye babies and 10 great big doll buggies. There were also millions of teddy bears they managed to stuff in the giant oval hat boxes. These were strategically placed to catch your eye from all angles of the store. In my dreams, I would see these dolls and toys come to life. It was a magical place to be, and you could not imagine a more colorful shop in the entire world. In front of the dolls and the toys and the soldiers, so many pull toys, I could hardly see the glass window behind. Next to the China dolls and in between the plastic tigers from the miniature circus stood my favorite doll in the whole world. She was the sailor doll with a head full of golden curls and a huge dimples that made her face beam and light up with the fluorescent scene. This charming doll happily stood in the shop window, and she actually seemed to tap dance when the toy train would pass by her toes. I guess my mother pulled me away after what seemed like hours of constant staring. After all, she was the practical one, which made us realize the harsh reality of our situation. My mother's favorite saying of choice was Santa was broke just like everyone else in this town. And off we went, no questions asked. Only my prayers and my mumbled into the chilly night air. It's a good thing that I have such a good imagination, I said to myself, or else I would really have to come up with a better solution on how to get that doll for myself. Next year would be different. Next year I will make it different. The three of us continued our short journey home, right through serene winter's snow. Quite a few inches had fallen since noontime, so Sally Ann made sure she kicked as much snow as possible. Sally Ann skipped and hopped and danced along the sidewalk. She thought it was terribly funny to keep falling face first into the large mounds of snow that had actually accumulated during the entire day. My mother tried to ignore her until she finally tossed herself into what she thought was a fresh pile of snow. It turned out Sally Ann had actually tripped and fallen into Old Man Porter's chum bin. This was filled with chopped fish goop in order for the fishermen to throw it to the river to attract the larger fish from the fishing boat. The bin itself was covered also with 5 or 6 inches of freshly fallen snow. Sally Ann was drenched from the top of her head to the white-soled Mary Jane shoes on her feet. My sister and I had begun to splash around with this fishy mess. She also started to cry and howl very loudly, attracting everyone's attention along the crowded street. My mother quickly pulled my sister up and tried to wipe her off. However, we were forced to walk home surrounded by the reeking fish odors that still seemed to be present in the air, no matter how fast we walked. The smell was so strong, it was as if there was an invisible force field surrounding us that made people stop what they were doing and gasp. One woman, who happened to be walking next to us, looked up at my mother when she caught a whiff of the stink and instinctively grabbed her baby carriage and rushed into the bakery. She proceeded to stand behind the closed glass door with a bewildered look in her eye. Eventually, my mother made the 3 of us trot, then run, and looks and stares were given by the many strangers about. They were all wondering why we all smelled like Ramsey's Fish Mart from the bottom of the hill. As we returned home, my father Ben was there on the porch waiting. He waved and smiled until he saw the frantic panic look in my mother's eyes. "Mary, what's wrong?" he said, just as the unusual smell reached his unsuspecting nostrils. "Oh my goodness!" We were the only words he could manage to say before my parents raced my sister inside. My mother and father carefully removed, then discarded her dripping wet, foul-smelling garments. I distinctly heard my mother say in a shaky voice, "Ben, find the trash bin." My father reached for the silver trash can, stretching way across the floor. Then he flipped the soiled dress and shoes under the garments into the can, causing them to make a thud at the bottom. While holding his nose, he cautiously and continued outside to the end of the walkway. He covered the pail tightly with the wooden lid and said a prayer, hoping that his pail would not attract the attention of every neighborhood cat. My sister was being bathed for what seemed to be the 5th time now. I could hear Sally Ann blubbering in the metal bathtub, causing an eerie echo throughout the entire house. My father tried his best to comfort my sister, but the constant bathing and scrubbing made her as unhappy as possible. I lay there in my bed, but I still have the memory of that happy doll on my mind. Every night I would dream of owning her and having her in my collection. I had always imagined that my magical dolls and bears were dancing and swaying when the lights went out. I also thought from the corner of my eyes that I had seen them doing a secret ballet, but I could never be sure. It was impossible to forget her marvelous golden curls and her rosy, chubby cheeks. She was really the cutest doll in the shop. Her tapping feet looked like they were ready to dance at any time. She was just so perfect, just so cheerful. I could not help but smile just thinking of her sweet face. I had many other dolls in my collection, but it would never be complete without her among them. Just as soon as the thought came back in my mind, I could hear Sally Ann screaming, getting much louder now from the bathroom. The 6th borax soap was about to commence, and Sally Ann's voice had become hoarse from the noise she was making. I felt so awful for her. I had gotten out of my bed to lie the flannel bedclothes out of her favorite bear to sleep with. Just about then I heard Mother ruckusing in the bath. Through the wall I was aware of my father's falling and splashing and trying to help my mother clean up the sudsy, watery mess. It seems the bubbly mishap had crept outside the bathroom and began its journey down our long wooden hallway. My mother yelled, "Benny, please get more towels." My father grumbled and scurried to fetch my mother more towels for the lathered floor. After what seemed like hours of boiling water and soaking and scouring, the house eventually quieted down. Later that night, when my sister and I went to bed, I could faintly hear my sister still whimpering over the night's events as she lay in her bed next to mine. I think I could still smell that fishy stench, but my father told me to forget about it. I clearly heard my mother say, "Boy, Benny, do I need a hot toddy." "Whew," he said. "My thoughts exactly," he replied again, nodding extremely wearily. The tired pair suddenly turned to leave our bedroom, and the covers reached our chins, and we heard, "Good night, Dorothy," from my mother. "Good night, Sally." "Good night again." My sister and I chanted together, "Good night," and our parents' footsteps could be heard getting further away. They were uttering words to one another, but I could not hear what they exactly were saying. To get my sister to fall asleep, I dimmed the night lights. I glimmed it with a blue hanky. I sat at the edge of the bed and handed Sally Ann her tattered teddy bear, and of course she hugged him ever so tightly. My hands then clutched the golden music box that lay upon the overfilled shelf. I wound it till the end. The tune carried throughout the room. This seemed to soothe Sally Ann's nerves for the moment. Then I began to tell her the bedtime story she loved the most, about the fantastic toys of the world. "Be quiet, Sally, and I will tell you all about what happens to the toy shop when no one is around," I said to her as I caressed her blonde curly hair. Sally Ann's eyes grew large, and she envisioned the dancing clowns and the dolls at the magical toy shop in our village. "When you turn the lights out and the people go home for the night, something wonderful happens, a very miraculous thing." My hands pointed to the different faces among us. Sally Ann appeared to really love the stories about the many colorful dolls and the tap dancing. Before way too long, Sally Ann had stopped her crying and drifted into a peaceful sleep. I really had wondered myself if all of my dolls and bears did not tap dance around this room when no one was looking. But for tonight, she was sound asleep, and I would have to save that mystery for another day. That concludes Chapter 1. Thank you and have a good night. Tune in tomorrow for Chapter 2.